The 5-year-long Syrian conflict has claimed the lives of more than 220,000, and it's displaced more than 9 million. What started as anti-government protests during the 2011 Arab Spring soon led to an all-out war between President Bashar al-Assad's oppressive regime and the opposition. As the years of fighting continued, evidence of war crimes and chemical weapons use against civilians emerged in 2013. That same year, with the fractured rebel groups struggling to gain the upper hand in the conflict, the Islamic State rose from the chaos. The extremist militants first seized control of regions in northern Syria before they spread east to Iraq, seeking to establish a caliphate. Half a decade of war has left wounds, deep wounds, and with no end in sight to the conflict, what can possibly be done to secure peace in the region? And what should be the continued role of the West? Joining us to answer that question is Ubay Shabander. He is communications director of Orient News, also a former advisor to the Syrian Opposition Coalition. Patrick Hillsman is a journalist who writes about the Middle East and has spent time in Syria. And later we'll be joined by Lina Sergi Attad from the Karam Foundation to talk about the humanitarian crisis that the conflict has caused. Ubay, I'm going to start with you. How did protests turn into all-out civil war?
Well, for the first, 6 months, the protests were mainly led by students. It was a civil society movement. It was nonviolent. And you had a very brutal response by the Assad regime. Students, workers, Syrians from all walks of life were marching in the streets without guns. They were raising olive branches. In fact, some of the student leaders were actually carrying flowers to give to the Assad regime soldiers that were there to kill them. And it quickly escalated. People are going to defend themselves when the Assad regime responded to the olive branches by launching Scud missiles, attack helicopters, and live fire into crowds of innocent civilians. People took arms to defend themselves, to defend their neighborhoods. And that's when an unarmed civilian protest movement quickly turned into a rebel uprising across the whole nation.
And how did Bashar al-Assad manage to hold on to so much power when, we look in Libya, we see something different. We look in Egypt, we saw something different. Why was Syria so difficult to sort of yield regime change?
Well, in the first year of the revolution, you heard many pundits. In fact, you would hear the statement quite often that Bashar al-Assad's days are numbered. We heard it multiple times from the White House. In fact, many folks gave the Assad regime tops 3 to 6 months because it was clear that the whole country was rising up against him. Momentum was against him. We were seeing YouTube clips coming out, being blasted to the world of the atrocities of the Assad regime. And many of the activists, many of the revolutionary activists that you spoke with were convinced that the United States and NATO forces would come to their aid to defend them against the Assad regime's reprisals and brutality. And in fact, we have seen the Assad has lost a lot of territory. Let's be clear about that. He's lost a significant chunk of the country that is outside of his rule. He's been able to hold on to the last vestiges of power in the capital and along the coast of the country, mainly due to this emergency infusion of cash, weapons, and fighters that the Iranian government and Lebanese Hezbollah, the Shia militia force that controls Lebanon, that have moved into Damascus. We're talking about tons of equipment every week, and let's not forget the Russians. Vladimir Putin has also played a very instrumental role in providing the Assad regime the ammunition, the attack aircraft, the tanks that Assad needs to maintain his war machine. So he is holding on, but just barely.
Patrick, one of the questions that many people had was how is Assad able to stay in power when there were so many rebel groups going against him? There were so many different factions that were sure that Assad wasn't the right leader, that wanted to overturn. Why did they not come together? Why was there not some sort of unity party, some sort of unity faction that at least for the purpose of ousting Assad could come together peacefully?
I think that that's what a lot of people obviously want to see, but the technical aspects of actually doing that are very tricky, because it's hard to go from people who started off as army defectors. And it's important to remember that a lot of this uprising started with people refusing to fight for the Syrian Arab army and refusing to suppress the protesters. So a lot of these people who became the original fighters for the FSA were actually started as refuseniks. And it's very difficult.
Absolutely.
Structure, it's hard to arrange discipline.
Lena, how do you see this? There's the issue, of course, of groups that simply can't come together. There's the refusenik piece of this. There's the stubbornness of the Assad regime. All of that combined makes for a very sort of tough situation. And then enter Daesh or the Islamic State, ISIS, what have you. How do they play into this? There's obviously a gap that they were able to fill in Syria. How and why?
Well, I can see inside Syria, as Ubay was talking about, it really differs in terms of civilians being affected by this war from area to area. So, for instance, I have a friend right now in Aleppo, and he has been telling me over the last few days that it has become a ghost town. It's no longer the bustling city it used to be, and it's being attacked constantly by barrel bombs by the Assad regime, and a large portion of it is under siege as well. So you have different areas with displaced by the thousands and hundreds of thousands. And then you have areas out inside Damascus where life is almost as usual, as much as you can expect during a war. Whereas right out in the outskirts of Damascus, people are suffering hunger and suffering diseases, and humanitarian aid just can't enter into those areas. So it depends on where you are in terms of being a civilian right now inside of Syria. But one thing for sure, if you are in Daesh areas or in regime areas or in liberated areas, everybody is suffering.
Absolutely, suffering indeed. And part of how they're suffering is because of the conditions produced partly by the Assad regime. When people talk about human rights abuses, when people talk about the dangers of the Assad regime, can you help us get a sense of exactly how serious this is?
It's extremely serious. We just heard today of 2 activists being murdered by ISIS in Raqqa, media activists, and everybody who's followed this revolution since the beginning. We've lost friends who were media activists. The revolution was run by these very brave people, men and women who were not armed with anything but their camera phones, and were continuously, and still until today, continuously uploading videos to YouTube to show the world what was happening inside Syria. So it's not a surprise to us to continue to lose these activists, but now we lose them by the regime and by ISIS as well.
Ubay, would you agree with that assessment in terms of exactly what makes the Assad regime so troublesome for the area, and particularly for the citizens of Syria?
Absolutely. Getting the truth out has been our biggest hurdle. The world has not wanted to listen to what Syrians had to say and what Syrians had to show. And this revolution was, what's ignited it was breaking the silence, breaking our fear, showing the world what this regime is capable of doing. And we were met with silence, deafening silence from the US and from the international community. And on the other hand, as Ubay mentioned, Iran and Russia and other countries are continuously supporting the Assad regime, continuously supporting the air raids. The US-based coalition that's fighting ISIS right now with its airplanes is allowing Assad's airplanes to continuously drop barrel bombs, over 10,500 barrel bombs in just this year alone. And so Syrians do ask, where is the world? Why do we not get a no-fly zone or at least a protected zone to stem the refugee crisis, to allow Syrians to go back into the country, to go home and live with the dignity that they deserve?
Absolutely. Now, earlier this year, President Obama explained the decision not to intervene in Syria, even after evidence of chlorine gas emerged. Here's what he said.
It is true that we've seen reports about the use of chlorine in bombs that have the effect of chemical weapons. Chlorine itself historically has not been listed as a chemical weapon, but when it is used in this fashion, can be considered a prohibited use of that particular chemical. And so we're working with the international community to investigate that. And in fact, if we have the kinds of confirmation that we need, we will once again work with the international community and the organization charged with monitoring compliance by the Syrian government. And we will reach out to patrons of Assad like Russia to put a stop to it.
Ube, let me turn back to you. How does this statement from the president make you feel? And is this a reasonable distinction that he's making?
Look, a chemical weapon is a chemical weapon is a chemical weapon, whether it's sarin gas, VX gas, or chlorine gas. The Assad regime is using chemical weapons today on a mass scale against Syrian civilians. They're dropping them on a weekly basis in Aleppo, in the province of Idlib. And now we're hearing reports that the Assad regime is dropping chlorine gas in the southern province of Daraa. The reality is that the deal that was brokered between the United States and Russia to force the Assad regime to give up his chemical weapons has not succeeded. In fact, we've just seen reports as early as last week that the Assad regime has maintained covert stockpiles of the precursor chemicals that are necessary to start producing sarin and VX gas on a rapid timetable. So what we're seeing here is that the Assad regime has managed to survive has managed to avoid international consequences in using rockets filled with sarin gas that killed 2,000 innocent civilians in 2013. And the Assad regime is hiding behind Vladimir Putin's veto at the United Nations Security Council. That's allowing him to continue to use chlorine gas barrel bombs against Syrian civilians. It is really imperative that the White House no longer makes this legalistic distinction between sarin gas and chlorine gas. The Assad regime is using chemical weapons, period.
Hit with a chemical
the only
weapon,
way
I'm sure
to
gas.
stop them.
Yeah, I'm sure gas is gas if you're getting hit with it. Patrick, what does it take then for U.S. Officials to intervene in a meaningful way?
I don't think that there really is a will to intervene in a meaningful way. I think that people assume that Assad would be capable of stabilizing the country, which is silly at this point because he controls around 30% of the country, and it's unlikely that he's going to regain control over the entire country at any point. And I think that ISIS is very good at publicizing its brutality. So this is part of a strategy by Assad to point to all of his opponents as being Islamic fundamentalists, which simply isn't true.
And I guess what I don't understand is not just the U.S. intervention, but also, Patrick, the Arab nations. I mean, is there a coalition of people who say, wait a minute? You'd think Saudi would be like, hey, wait a minute. You would think nations that go ahead.
We're seeing a lot more organized support from the Gulf states right now. You're seeing a lot of rebel coalitions in northern Syria. You have Jaish al-Fatah, Jaish al-Islam, and Fatah al-Halab, which are basically loose-knit coalitions of various Islamists and non-Islamists fighting against Assad. And they've been able to actually gain a significant amount of territory recently, which is a big departure from the previous conditions on the ground. But I don't think that we're likely to see any direct intervention from countries like Saudi Arabia or Qatar.
And is that, Lena, is that something that ultimately means that the only way Assad leaves is Assad just dies? Is Assad going to die of old age? I mean, again, with Gaddafi, with Morsi, with Abdel Nasser. I mean, there's this whole history of saying, look, we got to get rid of these bad guys. And I fully concede that the U.S. is in no moral position to do that. But nevertheless, the global community at this moment said we need to get rid of these bad guys. Assad is in a time where they say, hey, wait a minute, irrespective of what we think about American politics or even other Arab politics, what's happening to the Syrian people is a crisis and we need to deal with it. And yet, it seems to me that the fracture in the coalition is allowing Assad to live. Even the formation of the Islamic State in some ways fortifies Assad's place for a bit. Is there any reason for me to think that Assad is never going to leave office? Because right now I'm feeling like, we lost our moment. We had a moment, we lost it.
We definitely had a moment, and we had a long moment for the world to intervene on behalf of the Syrian people. I hope that Assad does not live and die of old age like his father did. I can't predict the future, but there are things that can happen right now that would save Syrians, like a no-fly zone. There should be no reason for Assad to be able to fly planes over Syria and drop barrel bombs over the people, period. And that should have been stopped from the moment he dropped the first bomb from an airplane on Syria in 2012. Those things, stopping his airplanes, would save thousands of Syrians' lives and help millions of Syrians return home. We go to work on the ground with Syrian refugees twice a year, and they want to go home. People want to go back to their villages and their towns. They want to create a life for themselves and their children inside Syria. They're not happy being refugees in Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan. They're not happy drowning while trying to leave Turkey and trying to get to Europe. Some of my relatives have walked from Greece to Germany recently, and took them weeks to get there. People are not interested in that kind of life. They want to return home. And for a lot of people, that means no barrel bombs. It's safe enough for us to live at home. And that's something the world can do right now.
Well, Lena, help me understand. Give me a slightly thicker account here of what's going on. Because, again, when people hear humanitarian crisis in Syria, at some point, I think sometimes people, just because we've been hearing it so long, they don't fully appreciate or try to appreciate just how dire circumstances are. Chemical weapons is one piece of this. People are obviously subject to certain types of attacks and certain types of weaponry. But what else is going on? Talk to me about refugee situations. Talk to me about medical and health conditions. What's going on?
The refugees that we work with in Turkey are urban refugees. They have left Syria and they live in storefronts. They live in basements. I've seen refugee families who live in places that they're not even charged rent because it's literally uninhabitable. I've seen many children now who are victims of child labor. My organization, Karam Foundation, has been working on trying to get children out of child labor. We also do innovative education programs to try to help the youth create lives for themselves through technology and entrepreneurship, as well as therapy to heal from the trauma in order for them to be able to go to school and continue their lives and become productive citizens, whether they return to Syria or they stay in their hosted countries. But inside Syria, the humanitarian situation is very dire. We are conducting aid programs constantly inside Syria. And for instance, in the area of Madlamiyah and outside of Damascus, meals inside that area this Ramadan, it costs 3 times as much as areas that are literally a few miles outside of there because of the siege because it's been under siege by the Assad regime for over 2 years. So you go from areas that people are dying of hunger to other areas where we support businesses because women want to work in order to support their families, and they're not interested anymore in receiving these food baskets and humanitarian aid handouts that the large organizations have just been shipping into Syria, whether or not the people need them or not. So it's a huge range of need and a huge range of suffering, but a lot of these things can be assisted by the international community, and that's Absolutely. What we hope to see.
And Ube, there are charitable groups like Karam Foundation and other places that are trying to offer some sort of relief to Syrian refugees. But the question I keep coming back to is, what are these rebel groups doing? When, you have these groups that are trying to win the hearts and minds, part of how you win the hearts and minds is to speak to people's material and urgent needs. Is that happening right now? Can I look to a Jabhat al-Nusra for, say, relief from bombs or for shelter or for some sort of food? I mean, is that unreasonable?
Well, if we're going to resolve the humanitarian situation, the humanitarian crisis, which is on par with Rwanda at this point, we have to also look at the battlefield realities in Syria, because every month we're talking about thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of civilians are pushed out of their homes, are pushed into refugee camps, or pushed into internally displaced camps within Syria with nothing but the clothes on their back. So we have to look at solving the military situation on the ground. Now, rebel forces, we're looking at a variety of factions in northern and southern Syria that really represent a pretty broad spectrum of ideologies. You have secular rebels, you have nationalist rebels, you have variety of colors of Islamists and nationalist Islamists in northern Syria, but they are united on fighting on behalf of one cause, liberating Syria from the rule of the Assad regime. Now, many of these rebel forces on the ground are also trying to win hearts and minds, as you said, of the Syrian populace by distributing food, by distributing baby formula. And this is part of really the fight for the future of Syria. What will a future Syrian state look like? And that really ultimately depends on who controls the ground. Will it be Daesh, or will it be the new Syrian rebel coalition under the title of the Conquest Army? You have to gain the support of the populace. And if we're going to ensure that Syria is no longer becomes a safe haven for extremists, whether it's Sunni extremists or the Shia extremists that are being supported by the Iranians, you have to give the civilians and Syrian children a better future, an opportunity for a better future, and you have to give them an alternative. And that's why the United States needs to intervene on a much more meaningful level.
Patrick, I'll give you the last word. I have about 30 seconds, but I'd love you to follow up on what Ube said here. What is the future of Syria, given what you see now, given the condition of the Assad regime, given the pressures placed upon it by the outside community, given the dangers of ISIS, and given the resistance from these rebel groups? In light of all of that, on that whole landscape, when you look it over, what do you make of it? What do you see as the future of Syria being?
I'd say that, first off, I completely agree with Ubay that a no-fly zone would relieve the pressure and would also be a huge disadvantage to some of the more hardcore Islamists. And furthermore, I'd say that this is the most unpredictable situation currently globally. This is the first truly postmodern conflict where social media and things like that have been weaponized. So we don't really know what's going to happen. I can never see Assad ruling the entire country again, though. That's certain.
Absolutely. Well, we'll continue to watch it closely, and both the humanitarian dimensions of it and also the internal conflict itself. I want to thank Ube, Lena, and Patrick for joining us today and for weighing in. And I want to thank you for weighing in. Keep the comments coming in the comment well. Also, check out our resource well for links to all the articles discussed in this segment. You're watching Mark Lamont Hill here at HuffPost Live. Stay with us.